Kia ora everyone, no mai haere mai. I want to welcome you all here today. It is great to have you all along this afternoon to talk about how to align our leadership teams. Now before I go hollering into an echo chamber, if you can hear me, could you please raise your hand? Fantastic. Isn't it nice when technology works the way it's supposed to? I'm Alicia and I'm really excited to run this webinar today. I love doing these. We always have a great chat. And in particular on this topic, I've been working with a lot of different leadership teams this year, and I've really noticed the difference that it makes when I'm working with a team, when we have all of our leaders on the same page. And I've also noticed that this isn't something that we can take for granted. It's something that a lot of people struggle with. So look, part of me is cringing a little bit at the title for this webinar. So talking about alignment and leadership in the same sentence is a bit like buzzword salad. Leadership is one of those really trendy things at the moment. It gets a lot of attention, and rightly so. I think we've sort of realised that if we want to have effective teams and successful organisations, it is super important for the people at the top to be leading from the front. But we do hear it a lot, and alignment has been tossed around in buzzword bingo since Kaplan and Norton first wrote the book on this stuff a decade or so ago. So I'm going to try and move past the cringing, because I think there's a reason that we are still throwing these buzzwords around, and it is because we haven't nailed it yet. Because look, it's really tricky, I think, when we've got a group of people around the table, whether that's at the exec team level or maybe at the top of a business unit, who are all fired up about leadership, particularly in terms of their performance and their team's performance, and they're doing all that good stuff. But if they aren't on the same page together at the executive level, I think it's quite tricky. And what I'm seeing day in, day out is that finding the right way to balance those hats, you know, your group or team hat with the organisational one is quite hard work. But it is really important, and while I certainly don't have all the answers, I do have a bit of road-tested insight on some stuff that seems to work and some stuff that doesn't. So I would love to share some of that with you today. So look, I'd like to start with a question to gauge where we're at. I like to think of this stuff in terms of an elevator test. So if I was to spend the morning in the elevator at your building, and I was to catch each of your exec team one by one in the elevator to ask about the overall purpose or strategy of your organisation, do you think they would all give me the same answer? If you think I'd get the same answer in every elevator trip, type yes in the chat box. Mixed bag there. All right, so maybe. Follow-up question then. Do you think that everyone in your leadership team, whether that's at the exec level or at another level of your organisation, do you think they're all on the same page? No. No, little bit. Yeah. Okay, interesting. That gives me a really good sort of gauge for where we're at. So look, well, it's obviously really important that our leaders are equipped to drive performance inside their own teams and inside their own leadership practice. If there's not real alignment at the top table, it's really difficult, I think, to move the big picture forward in a cohesive kind of direction. So look, just quickly, here's how today's going to run. I'm going to spend the next hour or so looking at what aligned leadership teams are all about, what the challenges look like, and what tackling some of that stuff might look like. As we go through, I'm going to do more of what I did just now, and I'm going to ask you questions and ask you to put your hands up. You can respond to me by using the chat box, which you're obviously all pretty good at, and using the raise hand feature as well, which just kind of makes the whole thing a bit more fun. It means that I can check in that what I'm talking about is useful. I've got the wonderful Diane with me on the webinar today, my assistant. So if you do have any technical issues, she'll be able to help us out if you go. And if you're hoping to set up a one-on-one or you have any questions, Diane can help with that too. So feel free to make use of the chat box feature as you need to. Look, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges around how we get our leaders all paddling in the same water and aligned, and how driving that sense of shared direction can make such a big difference. We've got an hour together. I'm going to get through everything I can in that time. You might have already picked up, I do speak quite quickly, I move quite quickly, that's how I roll. What that does mean is this doesn't always land the first time, so please feel free to take notes, take in what you can, but I will also make a recording available via email after this, and also chuck it on YouTube, where all my other webinars are, so you can visit as many times as you need to. Toward the end of our time together, I'm also going to tell you how I work with teams on this stuff, which you might find interesting if this is something that you think your workplace needs to put some more energy into. And hopefully we'll also have a chance for some questions toward the end as well, which I will do my very best to answer. All right. Now, has anyone ever known a family where the kids are really good at playing the parents off against one another? Like, this is really common in separated families, I think. Like, if you don't get the answer you need from one parent, you give the other one a crack. I think teenagers, I've got one myself, are particularly good at this. Put your hand up if you've seen kids play one parent off against the other. Oh, that was quick. All right, keep your hands up if you have seen something similar happen at work. Oh, wow, okay, yeah. I think that's really easy to do when the leadership team, whether that's your board or your exec or your parents, aren't on the same page about the important stuff. And it's not that differences in style or focus are important, but I think more that there are some critical kind of pillars that there needs to be agreement on. So whether that's discipline style or screen time or money stuff in the family context, or whether that's the way decisions are made around here, or what's most important at the moment in a work context. I work with a council who use a phrase that I really like, that I've chucked on the slide here, which is half conversations. Put your hand up if you think you might know what I mean by half conversations. Yeah, the idea behind half conversations is that the stuff that's said in the room or around the table is only half of what's said, or what's thought rather, or what needs to be said. And this is the kind of stuff that happens in teams who aren't aligned. So they come along and play the game, they pay lip service to the corporate overhead, but they aren't really bought in. So they're focused on the stuff that needs to happen in their own units, and any of that big picture stuff is an interruption or an annoyance to what they would consider to be their real work. So look, at the extreme end of this, I've worked with a university where the format for a number of years was that the exec team would come together for a workshop or a meeting, and they'd kind of nod their heads for an hour or two and everything would look fine, until about an hour later, when there'd pretty much be a line outside the Vice-Chancellor's office, because that's where the real conversations and the real decision making would be happening. Has anyone ever worked in a place like this? Pop yes in the chat box if this is resonating with you. Yeah. And it's destructive, right? It's the kind of behaviour that becomes quite self-fulfilling, and it breaks down trust, which makes it really hard to get that common ground between the people that really need it. So when I think about this from an organisational setting and the people that work within it, what I hear from almost every team and every organisation on my books is about silos, 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 silos. And I asked a question on LinkedIn last week about aligned leadership, and the most common response I had to that post was all about breaking down silos. So when we work in silos, we're all, heads down, bums up, and what you start to see, which is particularly unhealthy, I think, is this level of competition playing out. And this is all about power. So competition is the opposite of contribution. it's a scarcity mindset where the feeling is that there isn't enough to go around. And that kind of thinking seriously breaks down the way that we communicate, and it really jeopardizes our ability to achieve more than the sum of our parts, which has got to be the goal of being on a leadership team, right? And the problem with competition and the idea of winning is that it inevitably involves someone else losing. So Stephen Covey talks about the win-lose mindset, where interactions with others get shortchanged because we start trading off long-term outcomes and long-term relationships to get short-term results, which is really damaging. Nicholas Taleb is one of my favourite thinkers of the last few years. If you haven't read Anti-Fragile, you should definitely order that on your Kindle now. I reckon you could probably just read the first 3 chapters. I mean, it's a little bit repetitive, you do get the gist of it, but it is really good stuff. But anyway, his last book, Skin in the Game, has some really great thinking about this stuff. So he talks about symmetrical and asymmetrical rewards and consequences. So when we've got symmetrical consequences, it means that our outcomes are tied to our behaviour. So we're less likely to do things that don't serve our team members or don't serve our organisation or our customers. And what I particularly like is in the book, he uses the example of the architect in ancient Greece. So in ancient Greece, the architect, the convention was that he would have to stand under his newly built bridge when they took the scaffolding off. And so if the bridge was no good, he would quite literally pay the price for it. And I really like that idea, because when we have a mismatch and we contribute to decisions that we aren't impacted by, or we engage in competition, what we get is asymmetry. And this is exactly the kind of situation that we get into when there's a competitive mindset in our leadership team and we don't feel connected to the big picture, whole of organisation, whole of team mindset, because we think that we can win at the expense of others. And I think the more senior you become, the more of a danger this can be, because you have a group full of really bright, strong, clever people who've probably experienced their fair share of power struggles and competition on their journey. And that starts to change the way they view the world. And then when you engage in that team environment, you kind of need to put that stuff to the side. So one way that I think about this is the difference between working as an arrow or working as a circle, which some of you might have heard me talk about before. Now, competitive teams are all about circles to me. They work in silos, they've all got their own little fiefdoms, they've got their own priorities, they're battling for their own agendas, and they're not communicating and working together. And when you sit in a meeting with a team like this, you see them talking in circles as well. So when it comes to trying to solve problems or to get clear or to get some shared agenda, they wind up going around and around, and it's really hard to settle on anything. Put your hand up if you've ever worked in a circle team. Yeah. Whereas an aligned leadership team, they're like little arrows. They're amazing. They're all looking to the same end point. And the path there becomes quite clear because they can agree on where the money and the time and the attention needs to go. So they might be working as individuals and separate departments and separate units on a daily basis, but overall, they're all pointing in the same direction and using their resources with the same things in mind. I don't know how good you guys are at reading maps. I'm pretty rubbish, actually. Google Maps has totally changed my life, but what I do know is that if I want to get from point A to point B, which I'm assuming we're all trying to do at work, I'm much better off with an arrow than a circle. So I think there are a few key things that contribute to this kind of circle behaviour, and I'd like to cover them quickly. As a quick rule of thumb on this, we can use the acronym DUCK. So I was quite delighted when I pulled this one together. Like, it's always quite exciting when you pull off an accidental acronym, isn't it? It's the little things. I've got 3 kids, I don't get out much. So look, I did consider a bunch of cliche metaphors for this one. I thought about wheel alignments, I thought about chiropractor visits and that kind of thing. But the way that I feel about cringy metaphors is quite similar to the way I feel about buzzword salads. So instead, you get a duck. Okay, so 4 potential reasons for circle type leadership team behaviour. And the first one is diversity. So this one of the key reasons that we get to the point where people are operating as circles rather than arrows is pretty basic. And it actually has absolutely nothing to do with the character or the attitude or the characteristics of anyone involved. So I'm not even talking about diversity from a personal standpoint here. What I mean here is that in the most complex organisations, we just have this real diversity of functional areas and functional expertise. So whether you're in the public or the private sector, in all likelihood, the people that sit around your leadership table have got an incredible diversity of experience, and they're dealing with a huge array of service delivery. And it can just seem so hard to figure out how to pull all those threads together. And for teams that are coming together for the first time, or they've been recently restructured, or they're new, it can all seem quite overwhelming. So I'm doing some work with a public sector team at the moment who have recently been restructured, but actually I don't think we use that word anymore. Today I've heard realigned and I've heard revitalised, which I thought was quite nice. But either way, they've been restructured into a huge division. And the idea of this particular division of the business is to integrate all the stages of the service delivery lifecycle, from policy and planning all the way through to on-the-ground delivery, which is fantastic actually. But the reality of getting a dozen people around a table who've got completely different jobs, completely different focuses, and getting them to pull around a common purpose or a common direction is really hard going. Put your hands up if this resonates with you, that the work everyone's doing just seems as though it's too different to find that overlap. Yeah, and I see this one a lot, and I think it's a real mental shift actually to go from focusing on the differences to seeing where those overlaps are. Okay, so that's the D in duck. The U in duck is understanding. So I was talking to a team recently about building internal relationships and internal influence, and someone in the workshop said something that I just loved, which I'm so adopting when it comes now to internal relationship building. And they said, look, it's just harder to be an arsehole to your friends. And I really like that, because like it just kind of is. And I think that building on that idea of functional diversity and the challenges that we get from that is, I think there's just actually a really fundamental lack of understanding about what's going on in a lot of teams. So not only are we all grappling with some really complex and really different stuff, but we just genuinely don't get what other people are doing, and we don't have the time to understand what it is that they're bringing to the table. So if you compound that with some environmental factors like stress and overload, organisational change, competition for resources, what you get is a situation where it's extremely difficult to walk a mile in anyone else's shoes. And that load that we're all carrying, and we are all carrying one, is quite invisible. And when it's invisible, that shows up as people just kind of looking like an arsehole for not considering the impact that their work and their decisions are having on you and your team. So I've been doing quite a bit of work with internally facing teams over the last probably 6 or 8 weeks. And you might have heard me mention in some of my work on how to bring everyone in on strategy that this stuff is particularly tough for these guys, for those internal teams. So if you're servicing internal customers, whether that's in comms or policy or IT, customer services, this can be particularly frustrating. So it can feel as though people don't value your time or your expertise because they only put things on your plate at the last minute without considering how you're going to mobilise the attention and resources that they need to kind of meet those requirements, or without considering where their stuff fits into the bigger picture of your priorities. Does that resonate with any of you? Put your hand up if I'm speaking your truth at the moment. Okay, great. And I think this is what happens when we lack a real understanding of what everyone else is up to. So I have a favourite little trick for this one, which, look, honestly, I probably have a less than 50% success rate of remembering to use it. But when I do, it's always a real game changer, whether that's in relationships with friends or a partner or my kids or at work. So it's the idea that when you find yourself thinking, why are they doing this to me? You just take off the to me. Does that make sense? So instead of why are they doing this to me? Why are they doing this? And it's incredible what kind of thinking change we can actually unleash with that simple little trick, because like it's pretty unlikely that people are getting up and trying to make your life hell on a Tuesday for no reason. Like, I don't doubt that some of those people exist. I'm pretty sure I know some. But it's much more likely that they just don't have visibility of what you're grappling with and vice versa. And as soon as we take the work part of the equation out of it and pretend as though our colleagues are actually our friends, like I suggested at the start, which I understand is easier in some workplaces than others, we find it harder to be adversarial and much easier to think about what some of that pressure and context might actually look like. Okay, so the third part of the duck equation, the C, is all about clarity, and I preach about this one a lot, but this one is huge. So there's some really great research in the public sector around connection to shared purpose and common goals. And I like this research a lot because I think it tells quite a compelling story. So the headline data, which we see backed up really nicely in the PIRs, the Performance Improvement Reviews that the State Services Commission carry out here in New Zealand. The headline data points out that the public sector workforce is particularly engaged when it comes to purpose. So people are really dedicated to their organisation's bigger reason for existing. And they're really proud to be part of contributing to that purpose and to having that impact in the community, which is great stuff. Until we dig down another layer and we actually ask people what that purpose is. And that's where it starts to come away a bit. And we realise that while our officials are absolutely connected to purpose, they quite often have very different ideas about what the purpose actually is. Which means, of course, that people are all coming to work and making decisions and walking around with totally different ideas in their head about what it's all for. So this is that elevator test kind of stuff that I mentioned earlier, where everyone's beavering away and they feel as though their stuff is really important, and it is, but the golden thread that links it all together at the top table is missing, because we don't have real clarity about what exactly our priorities and our vision are. And when we don't know for certain what success looks like, everything's an option. And it's really difficult to get decisions that line up nicely, get our arrow going in that environment. Little story on this one. I worked with a team early this year, maybe January, February, on a program level strategy review. So it was a big digital transformation project and it had been running for a year or two. And the wheels had kind of come off a bit. So this agency had brought me in for a bit of a sort out to work out what the strategic position was and do a bit of planning about what the next stage needed to achieve. And this was all great and things were going well until we got to a point in a workshop where I put up the organisational priorities on the board. And so I said, okay, so these are your high level priorities, and I got about that far, and one of the tier 2 managers interrupted me and said, no, those aren't actually our priorities. And I thought, okay, I must have got dated information from them. So I asked if there'd been an update. Are these not your current priorities? I thought the board adopted these last year. And they said, and I quote, no, those are the board's priorities, not ours. Crazy, eh? So that buy-in and that clarity only went as far as the board, assuming there was even clarity there, which made it impossible for the exec team to agree on how to prioritise their resources and narrow their focus, much less anyone else that worked for that agency. So how we can possibly make decisions and get change and improvement in work programs happening in that arrow kind of way without clarity, it totally goes out the window. Okay, you ready for K? K is for knowledge. It's a biggie. It's a real biggie. And I don't mean knowledge like subject matter expertise, because that does not seem to be something that we're lacking in. I mean the big picture kind of knowledge. So not just about what's happening inside the blind spots in your organisation, which is really more about that understanding stuff, that's for you, but really the knowledge about what the broader context looks like and what strategic leadership is all about. So this is why my cat's looking out the window. It's actually looking up and looking out. So I am constantly astonished at how little exec teams seem to know about what's happening outside of their buildings. Now you'll know that a good chunk of my work is with government, with the public sector, and this is definitely worse here than with the corporates I work with, which is absolutely baffling in this environment. So we're talking about a sector where there is, in theory, very little interorganisational competition, where we've got data and information that is publicly accessible, it's easy to come by. We've got extremely similar counterparts at every level. So whether that's other councils for local government, other states, or other countries, we've got counterparts who are grappling with the very same issues that we are. There are dedicated groups and forums and conferences set up so that we can build relationships and learn from each other. All the building blocks are there. Despite all of that, I consistently walk into settings where I'm told that certain things won't work or aren't an option or can't be done. And I have to respond with, well, I'm literally working with 3 other places right now that are doing this very thing, and get surprised faces in response. Does this resonate with any of you guys? Do you put your hand up if you're like, yeah, this is mad? Yeah, okay. All of a sudden thought, oh, I might be getting into rant territory here, but no, I've got enough hands to make me feel as though my rant is justified. So driving alignment on the big picture is pretty much impossible if you don't have a leadership team who can connect the dots to their external operating environment. And I think that a good part of the reason for why this doesn't happen is because we don't know how. So that's the second part of that knowledge. So our knowledge base about what being good strategic leaders looks like is generally limited to our own experience and then kind of what we've picked up by osmosis on the way. So we don't tend to get good training around things like decision making and environment scanning and all that good stuff, because for some strange reason, and if you were on my last webinar, you'll know my thoughts on this one, we treat those skills as though they should be intuitive rather than learned, and so we don't teach them. And it's a lot harder to get away with this in the private sector. So in the private sector, knowing what's happening with your customers and your competition is a lot more life and death, business-wise. Having said that, this absolutely still happens. We are inward focused, we're limited by our own skills and experience, and we pay the price for it. And the outcome, of course, is this perfect storm where silos are not even just the easy option, but they kind of seem like the only possible option. So we've got all these teams of extremely busy, very diverse subject matter experts who don't understand each other, they don't understand their environment, and they aren't agreed about what success looks like and how to prioritise their time. And then we wonder why we don't see more alignment and everything seems to go around in circles. All right, what do you think? Am I speaking your language here? I'd love to know which one of these you think is the biggest issue in your team or organisation. So there's a poll here. I'm just going to launch that now. It's totally anonymous. I'd love to know which of those 4 causes of misalignment you think is the biggest issue in your team or organisation. Diversity, understanding, clarity, or knowledge. Totally anonymous. Oh, this is interesting. I wonder if you guys get to see this. Oh, yes, you can. Okay, so by a long shot, clarity seems to be pulling away as being one of the key causes of misalignment in your organisations. But there's a real spread there amongst the others as well. Diversity, understanding, knowledge. Oh, that's fascinating. That's really interesting. I'll just click share results on that one. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Okay, well, the good news here is that I do have some pointers on how we can start to shift away from some of that circle stuff and start to resemble more of an arrow. So that's nice, isn't it? I'm not just going to pull you all here and just talk about how bad things are. Look, what this isn't is a full and complete list of alignment exercises. I'm no chiropractor. See what I did there? The cringy metaphor. But I do have some pretty common sense recommendations that I'm using with my exec teams on a daily basis and stuff that I'm really seeing make a difference. So hopefully this is helpful to you also. So my first recommendation here is about making space. So if you want to transition to a more aligned and a more strategic leadership team, we actually have to make the space for it. It doesn't happen by accident. Operating as part of your leadership team is something that you need to prioritise if you want to see change. Strategy needs space. And the kind of big picture direction setting and alignment that we're talking about here, particularly for those of you who've all said it's clarity that you need, if you're a member of a leadership team, that is actually your job. So it's not some kind of annoying obligation that's getting in the way. This is a core part of your job. And those of you that attend most of these webinars, and it's lovely, by the way, to see all of your names here again today. I do feel like we're starting to be mates now. I know your names, it's great. You'll know that I bang on a lot about how strategy is everyone's job. And it is. Everyone plays an important role in contributing to the big picture, all the way down to the front line. But the difference between being a senior leader and a frontline staff member is that the way you spend your time and the kind of space and time that you allocate to working together is different. So the value that you add as you advance in seniority has less and less to do with your subject matter expertise and more to do with your role in steering the ship and clearing barriers for everyone else. And a lot of what we're talking about here, about driving understanding and trust and taking the time to simply know what's going on, can only be solved with time. So it's a bit like running or performing. There's no substitute for time on your feet. So taking the time to evaluate the big picture and to tap into context and do that environment scan, to talk about the big choices that you're facing, the direction that you want to head in, where that shared sense of purpose is between you and your colleagues, those are not the luxury tasks that you schedule in when you can manage it, especially not when you've got to build that understanding across multiple people that have all that functional diversity. So it isn't enough to have an annual away day. This is genuinely some of the most important things that you do in your work. And the more senior your position, the more margin and strategy space you need. It's literally what you're paid to do. And the more margin and strategy space that you create, the more successful you and your leadership team are likely to be. So I did a poll on this one in my last webinar about how much time you think you should be making for strategy. So I don't have the poll for this one today, but as a rule of thumb, when we're looking at big picture stuff, so that's all of the thinking and chatting and planning that you do that you'd classify under that strategic umbrella, at the executive level, we should be spending up to 40% of our time there. Huge, right? I worked with an exec team last week in New South Wales who told me that they try to do this kind of a catch-up on a monthly basis. And then they told me that they have to cancel half of them because they don't have the time for them. Does that sound familiar? Put your hand up if your leadership catch-ups are one of the first things on the chopping block when things get mental. Yeah. Yeah, I say that a lot, and it makes sense. We're all busy, right? But that 10 to 40% is for strategic space overall in your job. So it's definitely not all supposed to be with other people. But if you're part of a senior leadership team and you're not carving out frequent, intentional space and time for this stuff, there is a real problem. Because like any relationship, it will become dysfunctional or it will limp along with it or die without the time or commitment to making it work. So Michael Porter, I love telling the story. I think such a good day. Michael Porter, grandfather for the strategy nerds among us, he went and followed a bunch of billion-dollar company chief executives for 13 weeks to figure out how they spent their time, to see what the magic combination was. A little bit Tim Ferriss-y, I think, with his morning routine and stuff, but went and followed these guys for 13 weeks to see how they spent their time on average. And what he learned was that on average, each of those chief executives of billion-dollar plus companies spent 43% of their time on activities that furthered their business. That's the strategy stuff. And that included about half an hour every morning strategizing and planning. So emails, calls, walk-ins, all that other stuff, leaving that till at least lunchtime, and half an hour in the morning just on strategy. So it's worth making the point that we are talking quality over quantity still here. So our units of time, they're not equal. And we're far better off spending less time on this and making it really good, productive time than we are meeting every day and getting stuck down an operational rabbit hole. I definitely believe that. But with that said, you still need to actually make the time. So as a starting point, the evidence suggests that if you can just achieve the 90-10 rule, so 10% of time spent on strategic stuff, then you will see an obvious benefit. And that sounds a lot better for those of you when I said 40% who just kind of went, oh my God, I can't do that. But it's still half a day a week. So that's 2 days a month or a week a quarter. And if that seems mad, like if that seems unachievable to any of you at the moment, it is definitely time to shift that balance. Can I get a quick estimate from you guys in the chat box? How much of your time, like, you know, licking your index finger and putting it in the air to tell the direction of the wind type accuracy, but a quick estimate of the percentage of your time that you think you're currently allocating to doing that really strategic stuff as a leadership team? What do you reckon? Oh, 35%. Oh, 2%. I love the spread on that. That's fantastic. Yeah, 5%. That's pretty common. Yeah, a few 5%ers in there. Interesting, thank you. Okay, so my second tip, first tip, make space. Second tip, disagree. So I think we need to make it possible and safe and encouraged to disagree. I do not think we disagree enough. This is that half conversation, line outside the Vice Chancellor office stuff. I think we misunderstand alignment. Alignment is misunderstood quite often as being about agreement, and it just isn't. My definition of alignment is productive disagreement that leads to a consensus. Can you hear the difference in that? Agreement versus productive disagreement that reaches a consensus. So honestly, I think the idea that we can get a room full of smart, dedicated people who do totally different things to agree on everything is just a bit silly. And honestly, I don't even think that's desirable. Because if our ideas and our direction go untested and we're sitting in a room full of nodding heads, this is a really bad sign in my experience. It either means that we are missing something, or it means that we have zero diversity in the room, or it means that people are having those half conversations I talked about earlier and not contributing openly in the room. So alignment as productive disagreement is quite different. In this situation, we're able to expose all of the different perspectives that we're grappling with and put those on the table. Because like that visible and invisible load stuff that we talked about under the understanding piece, we can't work with what we can't see. So we don't need to resolve all of our differences, but we do need to have some agreement between us about how we manage them and what the rules are for edging around those conversations. So I spoke at a wonderful event in Sydney a couple of weeks ago, and Dr. Amy Silver was one of the keynotes, and she talked about this idea of psychological safety and how important it is to have a workplace environment where people feel safe to speak up, even if it might make them look silly, or it might mean that they come into conflict with each other, or they might look as though they don't know what they're talking about. And this is so super important on a leadership team. I would go as far as to say that in my experience, it could be the most telling sign whether or not we can get organisational alignment, is whether we can get people safely disagreeing around a table together. And if you're good at disagreeing, and I can see that playing out early on, I have a lot more faith in how our strategy process is going to go. When everyone's just kind of sitting there uneasily nodding their heads, I know I've got a lot more work to do to surface those tensions and get to the bottom of everything. Okay, so number one, make space. Number two, disagree. My third tip here is about nailing your strategy. This one won't surprise you. I am the strategy chick after all. But honestly, if you don't know what you're lining up for and you don't know what direction the arrow is supposed to be pointing in, how on earth can you get alignment? And for the majority of you that said clarity was the biggest challenge holding your team back from alignment at the moment, I think you know what I'm talking about. So in the kind of conversations I talked about, situations rather, that I talked about earlier, where we have all of that functional diversity, this is so important. Getting clarity on the purpose and the priorities in your leadership team and agreement on what success is going to look and feel like are just an absolute non-optional component to getting alignment. You can do all the navel gazing and personality matrices and team building days you like. You can know what colour or bird or Myers-Briggs acronym your colleagues are. But if you don't know very clearly exactly what you're aiming for, then it's all an absolute waste of time. Strategy first, navel gazing second. Okay, so that was a lot in one go, and I'm going to ground this for you shortly with 3 clear tips that you can go away and start using today, and I'm going to ask you a few questions. But before I do that, at the start of the webinar, I promised I'd give you everything I could in the time we had, and then I'd show you where to get more help, and I'm going to do this quickly. The recording of this webinar will be made available at the end, which means that you can go back and watch and run through what we've covered, and you can take notes and do what you need to do. Help-wise, I work with senior leadership teams and I coach them, and I love it. It's so much fun. So I do this over usually 6 to 12 months, and I do that to drive the kind of strategic alignment that we've been talking about today. And I love it. I get to spend some really intensive time with a leadership team to help them to build a strong relationship and get real alignment. And I don't operate quite like your normal coach. I'm not for everyone. So there's not much in the way of the navel gazing and the personality testing and all the kind of stuff I've just been poking fun at. And instead, there's a lot in the way of actually doing the work and crunching the hard issues and learning new stuff. So there's a lot of challenge, a lot of laughter, usually a couple of excellent group dinners, a few bottles of red wine if I can swing it. I'm not taking many of these on next year. I am booking on this front, but if you do want to have a conversation and see if that might work for you, then do feel free to hang around at the close of the webinar or pop your details in the chat box. And lovely Diane will be in touch for us to have a chat. Okay, so before I move into my 3 quick tips, I'd be really keen to know if you've got any questions. So if you would like to speak to your questions, please chuck your hand up, or if you'd just like to put that in the chat box, that is fine as well. I'll give you a couple of minutes on that one. Oh, more 2%. So I've just seen the rest of those chat results. 2%'s a bit scary, really, isn't it? I'd love to hear a bit more from you guys about how you think you might shift that balance from 2 to much closer to the 10. All right, any questions you guys want to have a chat about this afternoon? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Yeah, there's a psychological safety issue here, I reckon. Okay, all right, you're all keen to get your 3 quick tips. I can see that, and I am happy to deliver. All right, so I'm hoping that today has been of some value for you guys and to the way that you think about how to get that alignment in your teams, because for all the fun and laughter about buzzwords, this stuff is so important, and I reckon it can be the make or break between whether or not we achieve some of that big picture stuff or not. So first of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who came along. I'm always, I wouldn't say surprised, but I'm just always stoked every time I run one of these and I see how many of you there are watching and listening. Such a good sign. Okay, so 3 quick takeaways that you can start using today. Number 1, guard your time. Get that leadership team quality time in your diary and make it something that you can't opt out of. It doesn't need to be long. It doesn't need to come with complicated agendas. It doesn't need to be in a boring room. It actually, I mean, I would say this, but I think the closer to your normal work that you try to do this, the more likely you are to be dragged into the operational. I had a workshop down south last month with an exec team where we spent the evening with some Thai food takeaway and some red wine. And I reckon we had better, more strategic conversations over an hour and a half of doing that than we'd had in a full day workshop a couple of weeks earlier. So you're not limited here. Think a little bit differently about this if you can, whether that's a weekly breakfast or a site visit and a chat. Do what you need to do to keep it focused and engaging and something people can actually look forward to and commit to guarding the time for, rather than just more of that crappy corporate overhead. Make some topics completely banned, off the table. All that operational stuff, just take it away, because as soon as you start going there, it will suck your time. Okay, number 2, argue. Find a way to have an argument. Start safely if you need to with something non-work, but get that argument muscle moving. I think arguments get such a bad rap. It's a really pejorative sort of a word, which I think is quite silly. I mean, if you've ever written an essay or worked in policy or law, you'll know that an argument is a perfectly neutral and acceptable term for engaging with an idea. One of my favourite games to play with leadership teams that I think are too agreeable is that we run a debate. So anyone who ever went to a law school moot will know what I'm talking about here, or debating at school. But what's really fun is actually to just split a room in 2, nominate 3 people and run a formal debate, you know, opener, arguer, rebutter, and to chuck a topic out there that may be relevant to what we're on about or not. It's also particularly fun to put people on opposing sides to what they actually believe and suck all the personal out of it and actually just get people playing the game and figuring out how to argue well. It breaks down so many barriers, and it's such a lot of fun, and it's just so important that we're able to productively disagree. Before I tell you number 3, I can see I've had a couple of questions pop up in the chat box. So I will read those and try and answer them live, no pressure. The first question from Richard is, how do you work with someone who operates on feeling decision-making and not data? I think we've got a left brainer in the room who is feeling frustrated by the more intuitive decision makers among us. Like, I think that's a fantastic question, Richard, and that's that diversity thing playing out again, isn't it? It's about having a completely different way of understanding the world and figuring out how we can productively disagree to resolve some of that stuff. So, like I sort of said with the productive disagreement, we actually don't need to see the world in the same way as those that don't. And that can be particularly frustrating for those of us that like evidence-based decision making, and I'm totally there with you. But surfacing those tensions and seeing the places that we don't agree is such a useful exercise, and it doesn't mean that we need to get to the point where we see everything in the same way, but just knowing that around a table of 8, there might be 3 people that see the world differently, and that the decisions we make need to reflect all of those views is the most important step. So I quite often say that with decision making, and you may not like this actually, Richard, as a left brainer, with strategy and decision making, the decision we make is often less important than the fact that we're able to make one. So it's a little bit like diet and exercise. If you want to lose weight, it kind of doesn't matter whether you decide to do the keto diet or Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig. It doesn't really matter what your system is. It just matters that you pick one and you stick to it. And that commitment and understanding is actually what gets you the results. And I think making decisions as a team is a very, very similar phenomenon. Getting the decision right is less important than everybody buying in. Hopefully that's helpful. Question from Kim, influencing from below. Oh, this will be a good one. I'm hearing the other half of conversations outside the leadership strategy meetings. The other half. What type of mind-shifting questions could I use to get leaders taking on better conversations inside the strategy sessions? Guerrilla strategy. This is my favorite, Kim. It's my favorite way to influence. I love it. So what you're asking me is that when you know those hard conversations aren't being had in the place that they should be, how can you ask questions outside of the meeting that create the right thinking inside of the meeting? Look, obviously I don't have the magic wand for this one, but if we think about that K part of the duck and we think about knowledge, I think it can be really useful to ask open questions that provoke that kind of big picture thinking. So rather than challenging the decisions that have been made, which trigger generally quite a defensive response, pointing out things that your leaders might not be aware of from that bigger or external context. Maybe it's sharing something that you've seen happen elsewhere, or asking questions about how we've taken into account what's happening with a policy change or current events or the economy. Oh, what do you think about that? Those kind of open questions can be really useful to trigger that knowledge piece. And so even if you don't necessarily get the response you're looking for in the interaction you're having, triggering or planting those kind of seeds can be really useful for bringing an additional perspective when we're sitting in the room. And for leaders that do find it hard to have those full disagreement conversations in the room, using an external phenomenon can be a safe way to start experimenting with thinking differently, because that's not about the decisions that you're making or the behaviour that you're seeing in your teams. It's actually about, hey, we're all on the same page, we're all on the same team rather, and something else is happening out there. What do we think about that? How can we respond to that? And so thinking about building productive disagreement with an external force rather than someone around the table can be a really good starter. Does that help? And that might go some way, oh, awesome, I'm glad that helped. That might go some way, Roger, then to answering your question about how to make it safe to argue. And that's similar to the make space recommendation there. So time on your feet is a big one. If you're not spending enough time together, the time that you are spending together, you will find it difficult to spend in conflict. So number one is really about guarding that time and making that space. But then when it comes to being safe to argue, whether it's the debating format that I said before, or whether it's thinking about external rather than internal stuff, like the chat I've just had with Kim, it's about taking the personal out of the argument. Because arguments don't need to be personal, they don't need to be about conflict. They just need to be about how we engage with an idea from multiple perspectives. So if we can use a straw man or a phenomenon that is external or feels a bit more neutral, that can be a really safe way to start that productive disagreement. Does that help, Roger? Awesome. Cool, great questions, guys. I'm always stoked with the questions that come through here. You do a wonderful job. Okay, so 3 things we can do today for alignment with our leadership teams. Number 1, guard your time. Number 2, argue. And the 3rd one is that you do the elevator test. So if you want to find out whether or not your strategy is nailed, or whether you're one of those statistics or walking around with the different ideas of purpose in your head, just ask people. Nab your colleagues one by one, whether it's in the elevator or outside or over lunch or whatever stalkery thing you need to do, and just ask them. It's actually as easy as that. What do you think the big stuff is at the moment? What are you focused on? What do you reckon the number 1 thing the board's trying to get happening at the moment is? And just surfacing those multiple perspectives is such a useful start to figuring out where everyone's at. And I don't think it's a question that we ask enough. Those half conversations mean that we make a lot of assumptions about where everyone else is at. And the basic step of asking people where they're at are quite useful, I have learned. Fantastic. All right, well, we have reached the end of our time together. It is 1:28, so I will wrap up. Please have a wonderful afternoon and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you so much for making the time to come along. I'm just feel really honoured and really pleased every time I see so many of you at one of these webinars. I do appreciate your time. I hope it's been useful for you. If you do want to talk a bit further on this, I can see some additional questions coming through. Hang around at the end of the webinar and swap details with Diane for a phone call, and I will chat with you individually. Otherwise, I will talk to you all again soon. Kia ora everyone. Thanks for coming along.